Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to Governor Live. It's the first of the online sessions of Governor Live. We run Modern Governor. We've run Governor Live before as an unconference, which was very much. This isn't at Governor Live. This is at the NGA conference in Birmingham last year. But we've run this before. This is the first time we've done this online. And I'm joined tonight by Emma Knights of the NGA and Ruth Agnew, who's an NLG and also a governance consultant as well. And just here's a brief outline of this evening. We're going to introduce who's who and how you can take part. There are lots of different ways in which you can take part. We're going to listen to what Emma Knights has got to say, but a little bit before that and kind of around it, as well as the discussion around what Emma's contribution will be. We're going to ask you if you can contribute your agenda so that you can have some sort of input on how our discussion flows tonight. This is very much, and I'll explain a little bit more about that in a moment. And then we'll have an evaluation, and we'd love to get your input on what we might do with these sessions in future, because I think there's quite a lot of potential, particularly with governance, you might say, under pressure or under different pressures at the moment. So tonight's presenters, well, you probably know Emma, who's the Chief Executive of the National Governors Association. Many of you will know Ruth, who's former local authority governance advisor, unless I've got that wrong, Ruth. Is a national leader of governance and also a governance consultant. And then there's me, and I look after Modern Governor, and don't worry, that picture won't be there for long. Just an introduction on how to take part tonight. There's a few things that some people kind of get quite nervous about taking part in this, but there's a few things that I need to tell you. First of all, for this session anyway, this might change in the future, but for this session, we can't hear or see you. So if you're sat there in your pajamas, we don't know that. We can't, if you shout at us, we probably can't hear that either, unless you happen to be very loud or just outside the room we're in. That's pretty much guaranteed. Also, please use the discussion box, which is down here. I'm pointing, kind of down here, to reflect or comment or ask questions of the presenters. We'll have more on that in a moment. And if you lose your connection, which does happen, maybe your dog chews through a cable or your infant son turns the wireless router off, fix everything that you can and then just come back in. We'll still be here, and don't worry, you can watch the recording if you do miss what you feel is a critical part. And if possible, do discourage your household from doing Call of Duty or Netflix for the next hour or so. Get them to go and play outside if you trust them to. It's a lovely sunny evening here in Derry, and hopefully it's sunny where you are as well. But if it's not, then get them to read a book or something. Please don't state your school or setting, just if you can help it, just in case something comes up that you later regret saying, oh, I wish I hadn't said where I was. Please be respectful, as you'd expect. Kind of similar conduct for governing body meetings, really, isn't it? And if you want to, if you have a comment, you can provide a link in the text box below where I am. You just type in the www link and it will convert into a link that other people can click on. Also, people watching the recording will be able to click on that link as well. Please ask questions. So down below where our talking heads are at the moment is the text chat, and that's the main way in which you can feed back what you think of what's being said or any reflections you've got. And we'll look at that in a moment. If you're tweeting, please use the hashtag GovernorLive. Not everybody does. It's not obligatory, but if you are, then please do use that hashtag. And I feel I need to make an apology just before because I know many of you may have very high, as we all expect of children, and as every politician would no doubt say, we have high expectations of one another. But there may be a point this evening where we do fall below some standards. And therefore, if you hear the words don't, or doesn't, or mustn't, or shouldn't, then we'd just like to apologise in advance to anyone who this may offend. And, you know, you just need to live with that. So if you can, bite your lip, bite your teeth, or whatever it is you do when you're trying not to express outrage, then please do that, and I'm sure we'll be fine. So how do you interact with this evening? Well, first of all, the main one is down below me here where I'm pointing. There's an instant messaging section where you can type something in. So far, no one's really typed in anything there at the moment. If you can hear me, I'd like you to type in, yes, we can hear you, or tell us where you are or what you're drinking. If you've got a cup of tea, just say tea, 2 sugars, or something like that, just so we know that everyone's alive and that we know that everybody's here. I would type tea, but I've just got the I have the blessing of a microphone. So wonderful. Thank you, Kirsten. So you can do that in there. You can change the size of the text if it looks a bit small. There is a menu at top right where you can change the size of the characters. You can also change your text color if you really want to stand out from the crowd or express your political affiliation or something else. You are welcome to do that. As we move through, you've already done this, many of you. You can vote in certain surveys. Some of these are closed questions. Others are open, which allow you to give a text answer, which might then be shared with other people. We're going to use that definitely in the evaluation as well, so please do use that. And this is really one thing before we get on to some other stuff. Just thinking about what an unconference is. We've deliberately pitched this as not just being a webinar, which is very much watching somebody else present something to you and maybe asking questions at the end if they don't overrun. The difference between an unconference and a conference, you may have been to one, but the face-to-face Governor Live events we've run in the past have been like this. A conference, the agenda is definitely preset by the organisers. With an unconference, in some ways, in some aspects, the agenda is often set by the participants, and we want to give you the opportunity to do that tonight. It's very much always a presentation format, a conference, whereas an unconference tends to be a discussion. In a conference, the expertise is generally believed to reside in the person who's behind the lectern, or on the screen in this case. But actually, we recognise that in many conferences, the expertise is scattered throughout the room, and it's quite possible the expertise around the room may, not always, may exceed that, or at least come close to matching that of the person who's at the front. So we really want to tap into that. And it's difficult to be responsive to people's needs in a conference if you've got a preset agenda. Whereas if you can set the agenda, we can hopefully respond a little bit to what our needs are, in this case as governors. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to try this. This may or may not work, but we'll see how we go. We'd like to see if you can set the agenda for what we're going to discuss after Emma has given her input. So I'm just going to change this layout here. Now, if you can see some text, some buttons on the left-hand side. I hope that you can see this. Check this is all set okay. So what I'd like you to do is use the text button. This may be difficult on a mobile device, in which case you can type it into the chat box. But if you type in the text box, you could type in, I'd like to discuss, we're probably all going to discuss coasting. And then you can place this in there. And this is just a whiteboard for you to write onto. Okay, not to worry. If you can't do that, so what I'd like you to do is if there's a topic that you would like discussed, I will then put them onto this board. So what I'd like you to do in the general discussion box, what is it that you want to know in terms of what this government means? Is it to do with here or someone's drawing? But actually just use the text box and see if you can, at the bottom where underneath where the general discussion is, and just type in down here, something that your tensions between what we're being asked to do in schools and maybe the government agenda as well. This is really just to make sure that once Emma's talked about the things that she's kind of going to concentrate on as to what's important, that we can kind of expand the debate a bit more, expand the discussion. APPG, what happens when schools are out special measures? So that's it. You can just put them in the text box down where Andrew and Simon have typed theirs. Any of these will come up, I think, in what Emma's going to talk about. Yep, Gail, if you watched the second reading of the Education Bill, you'll have probably seen that there was a lot of discussion around what coasting means. I don't know if you found that particularly gripping or not, but it was certainly relevant to the whole coasting agenda. Okay, well, what we'll do is we'll maybe leave that for a moment. If you've got anything to type, if you want to type it in the general discussion box, and what we'll do in a second is we'll go on to Emma's presentation and I will kind of collate those that you have. So okay, so all I'm going to do is I'm going to stop my camera now, and we're going to move on to, maybe if Ruth wants to stop hers as well, we will go on to Emma. Now, if you've got a question for Emma, now it's entirely up to you how you interact with this. What I'd like you to do is if you've got a comment that's just your opinion, then just type it in the chat box, that's fine. If you've got a question that you'd like Emma to address at some point as we go through, we may do this in one fell swoop, we may do it in smaller chunks, then I'd like you to preface it with a Q, just because that highlights that it's not just a rhetorical question. You know, does this government know anything about school? Is a rhetorical question. But if it's something you'd like Emma to address, if you could preface it with a Q, that would be fantastic and very, very helpful. So I'll now hand over to Emma, and I'll stop my microphone, and we'll see how we go.
Thank you very much, Ian. I have to say this is incredibly disconcerting to be talking to yourself, to be seeing yourself. I'd much rather be on a stage with 200 people in front of me than looking at my own face. But hopefully it's not going to put me off. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. And let's see if this could be made to work. What we want to do, as Ian was saying, is really make it a discussion. So I'm going to pause every so often, and I'm hoping that Ian and Ruth will be able to then filter some of your questions through to me so that the conversation sort of makes sense at the right time. Since the election, I have spoken at probably about half a dozen different conferences around the country. So the issues that I've picked to highlight here are really the ones that people have been asking me when I've been out and about in different parts of England. So we thought school funding absolutely top of the list. Some of you, I think most of you probably are NGA members, and you'll know we've got our conference on Saturday, and so we've had quite a lot of questions flooding in to ask the Secretary of State, and school funding is right up there in terms of the questions you want to ask her, and I'm sure she'll be way, way better positioned to answer them, but I thought we needed to touch on that. Ian's already mentioned the education bill. And then you can see I'm slightly obsessed by the capacity in the system in quite a few different ways. The Ofsted changes, quite frankly, I don't find them quite so fascinating, but I was absolutely convinced that because there'd been a new framework and handbook published a few days ago, that you would want to have a bit of a conversation about that. And lastly, as Ian said, please, you say what you would like us to talk about. But let's start first with funding. What I did when I was preparing for this was actually to go back to the manifesto commitments. I thought I would be able to remember them, but actually one or two were slightly different from my memory. So this is what the Conservatives promised to do, and actually I don't think they expected to be in a majority government, but they said they were going to protect school funding per pupil in cash terms. That's in fact for pupils from age 5 to 16, so that doesn't cover early years and it doesn't cover Key Stage 5. They've also said they will protect the pupil premium at the current rate, but that's slightly more complicated, it appears, in real life than it looks on the face of the manifesto, because there has been quite a lot of debate recently about whether the pupil premium should be paid at the same rate to more able students. I don't know whether any of you have picked that up from blogs and Twitter, but that might be something you want to come back to. NGA's position is that we're great fans of the pupil premium and we very much want it to continue. We think actually its simplicity is part of its strength, and what it has done is really focused all our minds on that gap, and it would be a real shame to have that watered down in any way. The manifesto also talks about delivering fairer funding. I probably ought to have put that in quotation marks because we all want that, don't we? Everybody wants fair funding, but what does that mean to us? NGA has been involved, in fact, in discussions about fairer funding under the coalition government for the last 5 years. Very, very detailed discussions that my deputy Gillian Allcroft attends. And it's not simple. You'll all know that. It's not simple. And at one point it was the little mantra was about fair and simple. And a lot of us kept pointing out, look, if you make it too simple, it won't be fair. What they didn't use is the expression a national funding formula, and we think that was probably on purpose. Whereas both the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats did talk about a national funding formula, the Conservatives didn't. However, we do expect that there might be some proposals around changing to funding. And lastly, they made the point that they didn't want profit-making schools. And I think that, again, was because a lot of chat on the Twitter sphere and blogosphere about whether what the Conservatives were trying to do was open up our public state school system to profit makers. So they wanted to put a line through that. What isn't really covered is capital. So your guess as to what will happen to capital after the comprehensive spending review is as good as mine. Obviously, we hope to be involved in conversations over the next few months. Those of you that have read our magazine will have seen that we covered an article by F40. F40 is the campaign group made up largely of the 40 worst funded local authority areas. And we also included some figures from the Institute of Fiscal Studies. They were quoted, weren't they, time and time again during the general election, and they predicted that over the next 4 years schools are going to be experiencing between 7 and 12% cuts. And then lastly, we're extremely concerned about sixth forms and what the funding will mean for sixth forms, and more generally the offer that we make to young people in Key Stage 5. I think some of us are perhaps not as good at making a really wide and broad offer for young people together with, say, the FE sector as maybe we should be. So those really are some issues to start with. Ian, I haven't been so smart that I can watch the questions coming in, but do we want to pause to answer anything about funding before I move on to the capacity issues?
Yes, I think we've got some capacities there. No, I don't think there's necessarily anything there. The funding is, no, there's not really anything there at the moment, I think.
In particular, apart from it, yes,
particularly to do with funding.
I do notice, I think somebody somewhere might have mentioned special schools, and I'm really conscious that I haven't there, and there are also a whole set of other funding issues around special schools, but I think we'll leave that for now, apart from I don't like to neglect to mention special schools. So let's move on then to oversight and intervention. The manifesto commitment on that was that any school judged by Ofsted to be requiring improvement will be taken over by an academy sponsor. However, life has already moved on in the few weeks that we've had since the election. And you mentioned, Ian, the second reading of the Education Adoption Bill, one of the first bills into the House of Commons since the election. In fact, I think what the government is doing is repeating really what they did in 2010. They put the Academies Bill, didn't they, into House of Parliament ever so quickly and managed to get it through very fast indeed. And they seem to be repeating that experience. So yes, we did have a second reading today. Actually, this bill gives the Secretary of State really large powers, and that's not just for this new designation of coasting schools, it's actually to other schools that are in an Ofsted category as well. So it very much increases the Secretary of State's powers at the expense both of local authority powers, but also indeed of governing body decisions, and also in terms of parental consultation. So in a way, other folk have less say, and the Secretary of State and her agents, which in this case are going to be mainly the regional schools commissioners, will have much more say. Coasting's not defined in the bill, but you're absolutely right, Ian. Today in the second reading, there was some inkling given of what will be including in coasting. So I'm just going to grab my notes there to make sure I can remember. The first one that has been really quite well trailed is that it will look at pupil performance data over 3 years. So it's not actually about an Ofsted category, it's about progress data. And that's apparently going to be progress data for all our pupils, including the most able pupils. But for coasting schools, there isn't going to be automatic intervention. The regional schools commissioners will decide when intervention should take place, and they're very much wanting local authorities to work with them to help them assess when intervention is needed. And one of the issues that we brought up, and indeed, in fact, we were quoted in the House today, is about whether or not the RSCs actually have the capacity to understand this. How are they actually going to know when schools need intervention and when they don't? But the upshot of it is that it is likely that we are going to have far more interim executive boards than we have done in the past. And as I don't want to talk for too long, given it is supposed to be interactive, I probably will stop there. I imagine there might have been some questions coming in on this. Has there, Ian?
Yeah, there's issues around, well, it's to do with, well, in terms of the, it's very broad. You can see down there, Maggie's asked about capacity and staffing. Andrew's got a question about conflicts of interest. It's quite broad. And there are provisions for failing academies as well.
Oh, well, I can answer that. That's directly relevant to the bill, isn't it? Which is that, no, the bill doesn't deal with failing academies at all. And indeed, that was a point that was made in the House of Commons this afternoon a few times. I think a lot of people have felt that actually we ought to be looking at schools right across the piece that are challenged and are failing their pupils rather than simply maintain schools, local authority maintain schools. So that's a question well made, but it's not covered here. I mean, obviously, the government's argument is that academies per se are a school improvement intervention, that they will improve progress, whereas I think if you look at the evidence, that's not clear. We've had the House of Commons Select Committee report last year. We've had a National Audit Office report. We have the Ofsted data. So it isn't clear that actually one structure makes a huge difference. But that's obviously the government's position in taking this forward. So perhaps I should move on to the next capacity issue that we've identified, which is school places. Have we actually got enough of them, and will we over the next 4 or 5 years continue to have enough of them? I think it's been acknowledged by lots of people that this is going to be tricky, and we have struggled in some areas, particularly with primary schools, but not entirely with primary schools. So the Conservative Manifesto talks about creating a further 500 preschools in England over a slightly longer period, but also to allow expansion of good schools, whatever types of schools they are. And I think that the questions that I was suggesting there is that if you really want to have a system that has choice in it, then you really do need surplus places. And given how tight funding is, have we actually got the money to be funding those surplus places? But also, secondly, are we absolutely sure that the new places will arrive in the places where the pupils actually are? I think the jury might be out on that one at the moment, and I'll be interested to hear what people are experiencing in your area. Has this largely worked over the past couple of years? Has there been enough places for pupils, particularly primary pupils, or do you think we need to have a more fine-tuned system? And then I think this was the point, Maggie, that you might have been making, is that we need capacity at all levels in our system, and that means that we need more people who are interested in being senior leaders and applying to be heads. And I know a number of you, well, I imagine a number of you will have experienced some difficulty in terms of recruiting high quality senior leaders. And absolutely everywhere I go at the moment, everybody is talking about the difficulty in teacher recruitment. Yes, in particular subjects, I mean, as always, maths, science, but also increasingly English and modern languages are beginning to be reported really widely as well. And there doesn't seem to be as much of a response to that centrally as many of us would want. In fact, the word crisis is being used a lot when I'm with senior leaders. They will talk about a teacher crisis. And then what about us? Are there enough governors and trustees coming forward? I hope many of you will have heard of the Inspiring Governors Alliance. A group of us started that up about a year ago in order to try and encourage more people to volunteer, to provide an awful lot of information in one place. And I do know from my discussions with governors around the country that a lot of you are finding this difficult and are having to make a really conscious, positive effort to go out and find people to volunteer. One of the things that we're really pushing as well is that people do interview. Let's not drag people in under false pretenses. Let's make it really clear what the job is. I also thought it was worth repeating the Conservative Manifesto commitment there, that actually they were the only political party to make a comment about volunteering, and they said they were going to give people a workplace entitlement for 3 days a year for volunteering. And in fact, it was the Prime Minister who mentioned this, and he positively talked about service as a school governor. So I think that is an area where the government will continue to give quite a lot of attention over the coming years. Ian, is it worth me pausing to answer anything specifically before I go on to Ofsted?
I think there's a few. Let's have a quick look. There's plenty of things. Well, we're coming on to Ofsted really, I think, maybe because there's plenty of questions about coasting. What about a coasting academy? Is that okay if that coast? And there's Simon's asked something about, just a comment really, does making a workplace entitlement, does that mean that employers are happy to release their staff for governance? I think the entitlement is one thing, actually putting it into practice might be another.
Absolutely, but I think one of the things that it's really worth us doing is quoting the research that's both on our website and the Inspiring Governors website that the City of London Corporation did a few years ago. What they did was they researched all the different types of volunteering that city workers did and looked at what gave them the best skills for their own job. And hey, lo and behold, it won't surprise any of us, what they found was volunteering as a school governor was the best CPD for their staff. So I think we can be really quite positive when trying to sell the case to employers that actually the company benefits as well as the individual, as well as the school. But I agree that there's a big negotiation job to do there and a big sales pitch to do there.
Maggie makes the comment about governors being self-employed and therefore getting no entitlement other than I imagine that they can afford to give themselves, which is obviously an issue.
I completely agree. The self-employed are incredibly generous. You may remember we did a big survey last year with the University of Bath, the biggest ever survey of governors. And what that showed us is that self-employed people were most likely to volunteer to be chairs. So yes, they had the flexibility, but actually they are foregoing earnings to do that. So absolutely right. We shouldn't forget about the self-employed. So let's move on to Ofsted. That was the last thing I assumed people might want to talk about. You may know that inspectors are being brought in-house. They will be contracted directly by Ofsted and not contracted out through 3 firms from September. And I think that's really, really good news. I think a lot of us have complained about inconsistency. We've complained about additional inspectors, perhaps not really understanding what governance is, or perhaps not necessarily having the right skills to inspect the type of school, particularly again special schools, that they were arriving at. So I think there will be much better training and much better quality assurance, and I hope more consistency by having those inspectors directly managed by Ofsted. Very recently, we've had the new framework, which is now a common framework for all types of institutions that are being inspected, and also their Ofsted handbook issued last week. And I'm not going to go into the minutiae, although I have got some notes over there if people do want to go in the detail. But actually, yes, there is some changing of wording in terms of what inspectors will be looking out for in terms of leadership and governance. But I think the big change is around short inspection every 3 years for schools that were judged good. So those short inspections will be 1-day inspections. They won't change the overall effectiveness grade, nor will they result in the individual graded judgments for the 4 categories of judgments. But if by the end of day 1 the inspectors feel that actually there's something not quite right here, then it will become a 2-day inspection as per usual, and all the judgments will apply. So a shorter, sharper inspection for good schools. That's partly about the inspectorate trying to be, as it were, commensurate and not being over the top, but also, very realistically, it's about their own resources. All public services are being cut. Ofsted have fewer inspector days than they had before, so they've decided that they want to ensure that actually more time is spent at the bottom end of the spectrum rather than with good schools. The other thing that I thought was worth mentioning for governors is we've had a big problem over the last couple of years with Ofsted inspectors not really understanding governance structures within multi-academy trusts and federations. Now, they would argue, actually, they do understand it, it's just they don't have the information to hand. Quite frankly, I think it's probably 6 of one and half a dozen of another. But there is a little bit more information in the handbook than there was before. Now it makes clear that inspectors need to work out if it's a multi-academy trust, if it's a federation, and if so, they need to look at the scheme of delegation, and they'll need to decide to speak to, most likely, a chair of trustees of the MAT, as well as someone from the local governing body, if there is a local governing body. So I think that's very much a step nearer Ofsted understanding the diverse arrangements that there are. So we do welcome that. I think the last thing really to say to people is there will clearly continue to be an issue around availability of governors. We've had assurances from Ofsted HQ that they will be as flexible as possible in finding a time to meet with and to talk to governors. But I couldn't at first glance, and it may be others here at NJ will be going through all this in great detail over the next couple of weeks, so maybe I skimmed over it, but I couldn't immediately see that contained in the handbook, and we very much want to see that in writing, so that governors do actually negotiate timings. If you can't make the first time that it's offered, you talk about what fits with you and your working life as well. So that's probably enough from me, Ian.
Yeah, absolutely. If I maybe ask Ruth to start her camera, that would be useful. Ruth, have you got any further reflections on what Em's been saying in terms of whether it's Ofsted or capacity or...
Hi Ian, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Fine. Thank you.
Emma said it's a bit of a strange experience looking at yourself on the screen like this. Yes, a few reflections on that. Thank you, Emma. That's very informative, and I've got quite a lot of questions as well. Some of them I suspect you won't be able to answer yet because it involves us waiting to see what happens with some of the areas around the new framework. I just wanted to pick up a couple of issues around, I think it was Sarah made a comment in the comments box that the role of governor is becoming increasingly onerous, and I think that was around governor recruitment. And I suppose I wanted to throw out a bit of a question really, and around how effectively we are self-evaluating as governing bodies, because I don't disagree with the comment that there are certainly increased responsibilities for governors, but quite often I'm going into governing bodies and finding that it feels that governors are making the role more onerous than it needs to be, perhaps by being very hands-on, by being operational, by having perhaps more committees than is necessary, so fairly large structures, lots of meetings, and then feeling a bit overwhelmed by the role. So I suppose I'd be interested to know how people are ensuring that that's not happening, and what governing bodies are doing about ensuring that they're being really reflective and self-evaluative around that. And I was also pondering something that Emma didn't touch on, but I know is a great passion of hers, around school collaboration and the school-led system, and how we're going about as governing bodies ensuring we're collaborating to the best possible effect. I think it's a great challenge for governors who are obviously volunteering their time into their own schools, and we've talked a bit about the challenges of that, then being asked to look beyond their own schools into the wider system. But there's a great danger, I think, within the school-led system around governors being excluded, perhaps for that reason, that the professionals have got the time and effort to be able to put into work through the collaborations, and perhaps governors haven't. And also there's not necessarily an encouragement to, Ofsted still fail really to recognise work done outside their own school and work done supporting other schools. But it feels to me increasingly important as we move into a different, into a school-led system, that governors are involved. So I'd be really interested in if anyone here has any examples of good practice, how they're managing to effectively collaborate, and also perhaps that may ultimately have an impact on governor recruitment, where we may be looking towards federations and so on, but maybe reducing the number of governors needed. So I'd be interested if anyone's got any comments or good practice to share around those areas.
Folks, so if you've got things to share on that, you're welcome to put them into the chat box. And actually, it's really a space for you to. It's about sharing practice as much as it is about sharing knowledge from people who are there. Because I think among us, the expertise of governance exists in kind of our collective mind, if you like, because we've all got experience in different settings. And so, yeah, I'd be interested in what you think. So Emma and Ruth, if you'd like to maybe just look through those questions, and I mean, for example, Neil Carmichael moving to the Education Select Committee, does that have an effect on things?
And there's a question
yes, I noticed somebody asked about the all-party parliamentary group. When Neil told us he was standing for the Select Committee, he said it wouldn't affect. He still wanted to be chair of the APPG, and we just need to check the technicalities, because obviously you're not allowed to be an active part of an APPG if you are in any sort of ministerial or opposition job. But actually, it may be possible for him to do both. We know he remains enormously keen on school governance. He wants also to resurrect his school governance bill, which some of you might remember. It ran out of time before the election. I don't know whether some of you may be aware that he was involved in opening our Outstanding Governance Awards ceremony a couple of weeks ago, and very much reiterated his interest in school governance. So you could say, having a chair of the Select Committee who was interested in school governance could be a good thing. For school governors, we're probably going to be noticed. I don't think he's going to forget about us, whether or not he's able to continue chairing the all-party parliamentary group.
And Ruth, Simon talks about a facilitated self-evaluation of governance. What's your kind of take on that? And kind of, obviously you work as a consultant, but obviously NLGs can be involved in that as well. How does that kind of work in practice? Is it something that's viable for everybody, or is it just something that certain governing bodies could undertake?
Well, I think the word facilitated is interesting there because obviously governing bodies can undertake self-evaluation exercises at any point which they can facilitate themselves. And there are a range of tools available, including, of course, the NGAs and the APPG 20 questions and 21 questions for MAC boards as well now, which is a really helpful new tool. I ought to declare another interest. I'm a board member of the Governor Mark board, so you may have come across Governor Mark. That's I suppose it's the most detailed of the self-evaluation tools that are out there. It's available freely for download, although there's also an external accreditation process you can go through. And there are many people who are providing external reviews of governance at the moment. There's a whole market grown up around that since it was introduced into the Ofsted framework. That can be extremely useful in terms of having a fresh pair of eyes coming in to look at your governing bodies. But it can also obviously be fairly expensive as well. So governing bodies need to think through, I think, what is it they're hoping to get out of it? What's the capacity within the governing body to conduct that themselves? And I think something that we don't think about very much, but I hope will increasingly do so over the next few years, is perhaps some kind of peer review, peer facilitation. It may be that you want to get alongside another governing body that's working well, but differently from your own, and share evaluation of your mutual evaluation of your governing bodies. And I think sometimes just getting that external pair of eyes to come in and ask, why are you doing it like that? Are you achieving what you want to achieve by the way you're working? Can be really effective. So there's a wide range of approaches you could take, but I think it's increasingly important we build into our annual plan of work some form of self-evaluation exercise, either facilitated from outside or within the governing body.
It's probably worth saying that obviously none of that has changed as a result of the government. Given that we've got the very same minister back in charge of governance, we've got Lord Nash, I don't think the sort of fundamentals around school governance are going to change very much. We know that he's very keen on multi-academy trusts and interested in looking at different structures of multi-academy trusts. But we've also recently had a discussion with him about federations, and absolutely, Ruth said this was a subject close to NGA's heart, and it is. We are really keen that schools do look at the possibility of federating, because the evidence that we have from working with a number of federations is actually the offer to pupils, and indeed the outcomes for pupils are very much improved by schools, not just working together, not just collaborating together, but coming together under one governing body. And I think it's really important that, particularly with the new Education What Will Be Act, that actually we absolutely step up and take the initiative in terms of working out our own solutions. We don't just want to sit there and dig our heels in and wait for something to happen that is untoward. There'll be a much more strength in schools being together in a federation. And I think whereas before the department wasn't particularly interested, because of course federations are federations of maintained schools, not academies, they're now beginning to understand that actually federations can be a staging post towards a MAT, a multi-academy trust. They don't have to be, but they can be. So they're actually looking to look again, review the constitution of federations, because we've argued they're way too clunky. And any of you who've looked at the possibility of federation will have seen that you do end up with a bit of an unwieldy governing body, particularly if you want to have more than a couple of schools, and particularly if they include any VA schools. So we're pleased that we may actually see, ironically, a little bit more profile for federations in the coming year.
Can I reflect in on some of those comments that have just been made into the comment box? Just looking, Andrew's made a comment about being an NSS, and I wonder if everyone's familiar with that acronym. That's the National Support School. And I think that's a really valid question, the benefits to children of our school. And it's something that sometimes it's hard for governors to see beyond. And I think we're all challenged at the moment to look at how we can support the system as well as our own schools. But fundamentally, the responsibility lies with us for the children of our own school as well. Now, the National College cites significant research they've done around this, where both schools are found to benefit when an NLE, a National Leader of Education, and that's the research that's been done, moves into another school to provide support for that school. I'm not saying that would always be 100% the case in every situation, but leaders do learn by going into other contexts and bringing that practice back. So we need to try sometimes, I think, and be as open-minded as we can be about sharing expertise in the system and also learning from the expertise that that we witness in other schools when we as system leaders go out into those schools. I was also interested as well in the comment below from Gail about a Governor Vision Day, input from governors and staff and children. And I think those kinds of things, I am increasingly hearing of governing bodies investing time and money in those kinds of events, which are really helping them to focus on what is it we're here for, those really important issues of strategic direction and vision, and also issues around ethos. Really help, which always feel to me the most exciting bits about being a governor, the things that really influence the kinds of school we're governing and the kinds of experience our children have when they're in the school. So things like that can be really, really helpful and important in terms of focusing the work that governors do and making sure that they're streamlined and they're focused on the main strategic priorities. So thanks for sharing that, Gail.
Absolutely, and that might be worth a plug for the document that we produced with Wellcome Trust in January about how to actually come up with a school strategy that includes your vision and your strategic priorities, which I hope all of you here probably do know about it, but it's been really well received. And again, one of the things that I've been asking people as I've been going around talking at different conferences is how many of you have had that sort of day. So again, yes, I thought that was great, Gail, that you've had yours. And depending where I am in the country, it's still probably only about 1 in 10, maybe possibly 1 in 5 governing bodies that are doing that. So I'd really, really encourage everybody to do that, because there is no way you can do it in your normal governing body meeting. There simply isn't time to do it justice. So to have the sort of meeting that Gail was talking about, where you bring in other stakeholders, is really great. And I think the more we can do that, we take control of the agenda and we get involved in really driving that school improvement. And I also noticed, I think it's Simon has put a couple of posts there talking about how best to do self-evaluation with some sort of facilitation. And certainly that's something that we've developed at NGA. We've now got a peer review model, which is about a triad of schools reviewing each other. And that's worked really well if other people want to have a look at it and have a go. But what we found, and it is actually substantiated in the research, is that it does need light touch facilitation. Because if you don't have that, sometimes you can be reinforcing what is just perhaps long-standing but not terribly good practice. So we've got a model that does include some facilitation but is largely peer review. So I'd really commend that to you.
Simon asks a question about working more holistically across schools, so not just in your own school. Do you think the natural conclusion of some government policy might be that there are fewer governors available because they're removed? Therefore, there's a need to work across schools, not just in your own. And some people would portray that as the end of the world, but maybe people who don't trust many things the government does. Is that something, that kind of corporate working across schools, something you'd advocate or something you'd warn against? What's your take on that?
No, I mean, I actually think we should see it as a positive thing. I think he's absolutely right. In fact, I don't know that I know Simon, but a lot of the things he's saying, I'm thinking, oh yes, that's there's very much the sort of approach that we would take. So I think absolutely there's a number of ways in which governors can work across schools, and to go back to the Federation, that's exactly that argument that when you are governing more than one school, you have benchmarks across the school. But more importantly than that, you also have the wherewithal to intervene if you need to. They are your schools. They're part of your organisation. You are, of one organisation. And we're starting to think about federations as just educating a larger number of pupils, rather than getting caught up in how many schools have you got or how many buildings have you got. But there's also other ways in which you can do that, and other clusters where you can share good practice and benchmark without actually having accountability for schools. And perhaps this is slightly lateral thinking, but it might be worth bringing it up, and it's something that we get most resistance on. There's a couple of our positions at NGA that very active governors don't feel comfortable with initially, and one of them is the idea that it's good practice to move on to other schools, that actually staying in one school for a very, very long time can entrench practice and can prevent change and can make relationships incredibly cozy, and therefore not as highly effective as they might be. So NGA has a policy of suggesting, and this is good practice brought across from the charity sector, that we should move from schools after 8 years or before 8 years. So if you still want to volunteer, and that's great and wonderful, actually there'll be another school that needs your expertise, and that's a really good way of comparing practice from school to school.
Can I make a comment there as well, Ian? Can I just put in a word from National Leaders of Governance? We haven't actually mentioned them yet specifically, and I'm an NLG and work for the College's National Leader of Governance advocate as well. And obviously that's one of the purposes of the role of NLG. If people are able to volunteer beyond their own school and want to share their practice, they may want to consider moving into a system leader role where they have that opportunity to go into other schools. Equally, a number of local authorities have local systems where they share expertise around their schools. So it's something that you might want to discuss with your local authority, or have some kind of local arrangement between your schools where you are able to share expertise and share practice, including, and we haven't mentioned what's often termed soft federations, and would be collaborations under the collaboration regulations for maintained schools, where there are shared committees which might discuss issues that are common to a group of schools. And one of the schools where I'm chair has such a cluster that meets termly to discuss issues that affect all of the schools in the group, and also employ a number of staff across those schools. So there are ways, within current frameworks that we can take more of a view, wider view, rather than just our own school. And perhaps sometimes it's difficult even getting in contact with other governors because we don't have those networks. So it may be that our head teachers, our local authorities can help us and support us in setting up some of those networks that might be a precursor to some of these forms of collaboration which could really support school improvement and standards across a group of schools.
Ian, can I pick up on a couple of other subjects I noticed people have mentioned that we haven't touched on at all? And one is the pupil premium. I think someone early on asked, what sort of impact is it having? And you're absolutely right to raise that issue, because I said we were great fans of it, because I think what it's done is really made us concentrate our minds on the disadvantaged pupils, and are they reaching their potential. It certainly isn't working everywhere, is it? Because otherwise we'd have closed the gap, which most schools haven't. Some schools have, but the vast majority of us struggle to do that. But there is great resources out there, lots of information, some of which should be, your school leader's business to find, not necessarily yours. But it's worth governors knowing to point school leaders in the right direction if they aren't already using all the resources from the Education Endowment Foundation, the EEF. They've got a fantastic toolkit. They're producing piece of research after piece of research, some of which is hugely relevant to governing boards. There's quite a bit of research out at the moment looking at how we deploy our teaching assistants, because some of you may remember a couple of years ago there was a bit of a furore because some of their initial work suggested that teaching assistants were not helpful in terms of raising the attainment of disadvantaged children. However, it transpires that it's all about how you deploy teaching assistants and how you train teaching assistants. So it's much more nuanced than the initial research showed. The other thing there's a lot of pupil premium case studies out there, which the government managed to get hold of because it offered huge prizes, monetary prizes for pupil premium awards. So I think this is difficult. It's good that we're looking at it, but it's difficult to achieve. It's really important that we make use of those resources that are out there. That was one. And then somebody else asked about assessment without levels, which I almost put on my PowerPoint and then stopped because I thought I don't really know the answers. You're absolutely right. People are struggling. I think, yes, it's Chris there that asked about, are we confident? I don't think people generally are confident, but I think lots of people around the country are now taking it upon themselves to work out new assessment systems, often in clusters. Again, people may have comments about particularly if they're primary schools, how they're working together to develop assessment systems so they can compare across a family of schools. So yes, any examples of what you're all doing there, I think would be useful. At one point, there were rumours there would be a change of direction under the new government on assessment without levels, but I think they were only rumours. I think we have got to make the system work and hopefully work well. Ian, I don't know if other people had trouble. I had problems hearing you there. I don't know if other people
hear you either, Ian.
That's better. Oh, fantastic. I think that's very good of you, Ian. It's just put a plug up on the screen for the survey that we do every year with TES of governors and trustees. It's so important this year. We use the information for a whole range of activities, both to improve the guidance that we produce here, but also to prioritise the issues that you want us to take up with the government. And it has been absolutely fabulous in previous years looking at what governors across the country think, because obviously as NGA we do try to represent views right across England. We never can, because actually you don't all think the same on all things, particularly may I say on funding, but it gives us a really, really good idea of the challenges you're facing and what you want us and the government to do about them. So I know that the people logged on today are going to be active folk, but if you know of other schools around you that haven't heard about our survey, please do pass it on, because it closes on the 29th of June.
So thank you very much for taking part today. Those of you that were able to get in the room, we've been oversubscribed today, so some people have had some issues getting in, which kind of is a nice problem to have, but obviously it's not nice if you're one of the people who can't get in. But if you're in the room now, rather than watching the recording, we're going to stop the recording in a second, but please take 2 minutes to complete the following evaluation questions. We want to find out what topics you'd like to see covered in future sessions, which guests you might like to see, and also which questions you'd ask Nikki Morgan if you're going to be, or not going to be, at Saturday's NGA conference in Manchester. But thank you to Emma and thank you to Ruth, and we hope to see you again at the next session.